I have coffee with me.
I've got my tea, and folks, here we are. This is the December dialogue with none other than Richard Dolan. And if you don't know, he is the author of these two seminal studies, the UFO and the National Security State, Volume 1, The Chronology of a Cover-Up, 1941 to 1973. And Volume 2 here is The Cover-Up Exposed, 1973 to 1991. If you don't have these books, get them, because what I want to do today, Richard, is talk with you a bit about the, it may seem that my three topics of 9/11 and ET disclosure, or the topic of disclosure, and then your finding that you did with Linda Howe in 2013, I think it was, of the whistleblower that Eisenhower had attempted or threatened to invade Area 51. And I want to talk about these three things because I'm getting the impression that they're related. So let's start off with 9/11. You just recently did an interview, I believe, with somebody about the post 9/11 culture. And the reason I'm going there, Richard, is increasingly on my members area, we've had a number of members comment to me that everything seems to have shifted somehow in some deep way at 9/11. And I wonder if you can address what your thoughts are. I know that you've had some that you shared in the 2014 Secret Space Program conference in San Mateo about this post 9/11 culture that we're living in.
Yes, absolutely, Joseph. I'm really glad to do this with you for your site, by the way, and I hope your members enjoy this. Yeah, I've actually just recently, I interviewed, you and I had a conversation about 9/11, of course, and I also interviewed a gentleman named Andrew Johnson, who is really a student of the work of Dr. Judy Wood, and he and I had a very interesting conversation about primarily her theories about 9/11. And then I also have followed up with my own thoughts on how post 9/11 culture has let me say, I guess the post 9/11 mentality that we have has been damaging our culture in a variety of ways. So these have been on my mind. So let me just make sure I'm understanding your question. I should have just jumped in by hearing your question a little more clearly. Where do you want to start off?
Well, I'm wondering if the post 9/11 culture has not just simply created a police state mentality, but if it has in fact affected our ability epistemologically to evaluate things properly.
Yes.
Because I think there's so much cynicism out there, Richard, with respect to government, with respect now to, we've seen a lot of cynicism emerging with these ongoing, Russiagate investigations and so on. I'm wondering if this post 9/11 culture is affecting things in a deep epistemological way in our inability to trust institutions, trust what we read, and so on and so forth, because I want to get into this aspect of things in terms of your hypothesis about breakaway civilizations, deep state, and so on.
I hear you now. Yes, honestly, I think you're actually prompting me to think about this in a fresh way. I mean, what I believe has happened is that it's been now 17 plus years that we've been living in a 9/11 lie. Now, in the early period, let's say in 2002, 2003, 2004, when 9/11 alternative theorists were first making their presence known out there, it might have seemed to a lot of us that somehow this lie would break open, and it would be like opening up a bad wound, but then giving ourselves a chance to heal. But we've now gone for an entire generation of humanity that has been born and is growing up and has now come to maturity in a post 9/11 world, in which the established conventional official truth, that is the lie, has become so now ingrained. I don't know if I would have expected this to be the case, but it has turned out to be the case. And I now wonder if it's so bad now, that it's so solidified, that I don't know how easy it's going to be to break this open. There are those of us who see through this lie very, very clearly, but we're still in a minority in terms of the dominant cultural voices that are out there.
Right.
Even other, really smart people in the kind of alternative community, they're not all doing 9/11. In fact, only a minority of them really will now go so far as to say that they think 9/11 was an inside job. I think what's happened is a lot of the alternative research field is run away from that. And maybe they just feel like this is a losing battle. We're not going to win it. Let's move on to other things. And that would be a horrible shame if this were to be the case. And it's almost the same thing. You go back further with the Kennedy assassination.
Yep.
It's now been 55 years. 55 years. And in the case of that, yes, a lot of people do believe that John F. Kennedy was the victim of a conspiracy. And many will say it was a CIA conspiracy. But the official word remains that it was one guy who acted alone. And that's the official narrative. So how far are we really going to get with 9/11? And so this brings us back to your question. How does this alter what we epistemologically, that is, epistemology is simply our theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And it seems to me what you're asking is, living 17 plus years of a lie, an official lie, I do think has damaged our ability as a society to trust our own ability to ferret things out, to trust our ability to observe what's right there in front of us. And so it causes a disconnect between your own ability to see things and your reasoning ability, which is probably the single most important foundation of being an independently thinking and living person.
Right.
And so we're taught not to trust our senses with 9/11 and with everything else. We're living in a 24/7 propaganda barrage. And, the Russia narrative, this insane, ridiculous, insulting Russia narrative, is just one more iteration of this. But 9/11 is really the foundation of our modern world in terms of damaging our ability to trust the evidence that's right in front of our eyes. So I don't know how and when we're going to be able really to turn this around sufficiently to kind of wipe away this whole generation worth of lies.
Well, I think, this raises the other question I wanted to ask you. The way I view this whole thing, Richard, is that we've been in this arc of official narrative since JFK. And therefore, we've now evolved or engineered a culture in which there are really two competing narratives, or two levels of narratives. There's an official one, and then there's all of these alternative narratives out there. And the thing that appears to me to be happening is that and the reason I wanted to mention your UFO books is, of course, you're the one that coined the phrase breakaway civilization. And I'm wondering if we view this all as an arc of history since JFK up to 9/11, that this is somehow the product of this deep state manipulation of events and manipulation of narratives. If this 9/11 phenomenon is tied, in your opinion, to what you wrote in your volumes about breakaway civilization, that it is this group somehow that's behind all of these things. Does that make sense?
It does. Another way for me to think about that is to ask, to what extent is the runaway nature of this elite part of our world by design or by, let's say, default. In other words, the cultural. We're in a world right now where, okay, we've got. I mean, everything is utterly bureaucratized. Everything is utterly. Now we're in a 24/7 surveillance situation worldwide, essentially. There's really nowhere to run and hide. There's financial control that is so complete, so great. Think about how hard it is for someone to start their own business these days. Really, the only way you can do it maybe is digitally on the internet, but even that's becoming much more difficult. It's very hard for people to find economic, financial freedom. It's very hard for people to find freedom of speech anymore without having the hammer come down on them. I just did a YouTube video the other day, and they demonetized it because they didn't like something that I said. I had a fight, and they got them to remonetize. But I'm riding that line. I can see it, and I'm just waiting. I'm waiting for them to come after me and to come after you. But we're in a world where it's highly bureaucratized, highly legally suffocating in ways that didn't exist, I think, in prior times. And so in that kind of a world, and also at the same time where hope is being siphoned out of entire swaths of the population, you know, once there was only the underclass to orient jobs, but that class is growing and growing. Now the working class is becoming the underclass, and even now the middle class is becoming the underclass because there's just not enough places for them all to go in terms of a viable economy, and in which the wealth and the ownership is now so unbelievably concentrated. Like, it's far beyond what most people think. So in that kind of a world, if you're at the top of that little pinnacle, you know, there's part of it where you can see them wanting to transform our culture away from a freedom-based, trusting your instincts, where citizens are sovereign. Like, they don't want that kind of a culture. They don't want a culture where people can feel victorious. They don't want a culture where you as an individual have the ability to strike out on your own. They do not want that. At the same time, there are institutional forces, I believe, in the larger society that we're in that also promote this type of transformation of culture. So I think it's a little bit of both that's going on. I think, you know, when you have a global society that is so regimented, in which there's so little room for maneuverability among the people, it's almost like I almost believe there's this inexorable law that will create the kind of culture necessary to function within the larger socioeconomic situation that it finds itself in. So that means a culture in which we denigrate traditional virtues, whether masculine or feminine virtues, for example, because what we want is a culture that atomizes people and makes them feel helpless. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does, which leads me to another question, you know, and this is, you know, the $64 trillion question. If we view this all as an arc of history in American history from JFK to 9/11, and if we're coupling this to the idea of your breakaway civilization and rogue group, and you mentioned yourself that you interviewed Andrew Johnson, one of Dr. Judy Wood's associates, about her theories about 9/11 and the idea that there was some sort of exotic technology in play. To what extent, then, are we, in your opinion, able to attribute all of these official narratives, this whole arc of history, to that breakaway UFO group that you write about in your books? Because I think, personally, it's probably front and center in a great deal of ways that we're just beginning to suspect. But anyway, over to you.
I've hesitated to go there, but I suspect that the answer is it's a very high percentage, a very high probability that group is paramount in making things happen. Let's think of it. Look, Bilderberg meeting once a year. They are always way ahead of the curve in terms of what they want and how the world inexorably just goes. You know, they were meeting before the creation of the European Common Market. That happened. And there was a Bilderberg meeting. I remember reading the minutes from 1983 or 84 in which they talked about envisioning a post-Soviet world.
Right. Right.
Then came Gorbachev.
Right.
These
Right.
guys are way ahead of the curve. If we were part of that club, those very few people who own everything that there is worth owning, and we wouldn't want to work through such inconvenient groups as nation states. My goodness, we're transnational. So we
Right.
would be looking to create transnational structures to transform global finance and politics and culture. We have to transform culture. We would have to denigrate all of the traditional elements that would be in our way. And I think we're definitely seeing that.
All right.
Absolutely are seeing that.
To what extent then do you think that this breakaway UFO group, this breakaway civilization that you've written about in your books and talked about, to what extent then do you think that they have become a transnational group and are using their access to technologies that are off the books to engineer a lot of these events? Because I've got, this is why I wanted to talk to you. I've got tremendous suspicions about all these California fires, as does Catherine Fitz, the fires going on elsewhere in the world. To what extent then do you think that this group has really become a transnational group and it's no longer under the thumb of the American government? And the thing that I'm going to here, Richard, is in the Cooper Cantwell set of documents, as I'm sure you're aware, there's that very curious document. Whether or not you believe the documents are authentic or not, they do contain some interesting information.
Yes.
There's that one document where it talks about President Nixon turning over the whole Majestic 12 UFO secrecy operation to the defense contractors. In other words, he simply privatizes it, by an executive fiat. To what extent then do you think this group, this breakaway civilization, has become a transnational group? Is this what we're seeing behind the Bilderberg and these people?
I think the answer to that is yes. And I've believed for quite some time that the transnational group that basically sits behind everything still like to use United States military black budget power.
Right.
And essentially it's police force.
Right.
U.S. military is a great international police force for these guys, and that's the primary purpose that they use us for. Relating to the whole Nixon scenario, I think, I actually am more a believer than a not in most of those Majestic documents that you referred to. Years ago, I printed them all off one by one and comb bound them, and I read them chronologically. It was I was in terror of these documents because everyone just argues about them. But the thing is, when you read them through and you see the incredible depth and breadth of what they cover, the sophistication that is within them, there's no way I'm ever going to believe that these are hoaxes. If they're hoaxes, who are they designed for? They're
exactly.
Not you and me. Seriously? Like, is that the target? I don't think that they're hoaxes anyway. And I know something of the backstory as to how those documents were obtained by Ryan and Bob Wood.
Right.
From Cooper. I just don't think that they're fake. Anyway, the Nixon connection. Those documents do indicate that Nixon essentially transferred, let's call it MJ-12, to international control around 1969. I don't remember the date in that document, but I've heard from another source this exact same thing, that around 1969 or 1970, this came through supposedly from Kelly Johnson to Ben Rich over at Lockheed Skunk Works.
Yep.
Supposedly Kelly Johnson said this to Ben Rich. Same thing. In 1969, Nixon made MJ-12 essentially international. So this really goes along. They corroborate, and I think that they happen to be true. It makes perfect sense. You wouldn't want, this is a global phenomenon. And yes, the United States is the most important of the nation states out there, but it's a global phenomenon and it goes beyond simply the American president.
Well, let's move then to my second area of questions and subject I wanted to talk about. Since we're talking about a kind of transnational breakaway civilization that grew out of this UFO group, You did an interesting thing a few years ago. I think it was 2013. Correct
Yeah.
me if I'm wrong on the date. Where you interviewed, and I think Linda Moulton Howe as well, talked to this gentleman about President Eisenhower demanding to know what was going on at Area 51, and they denied him access, and then he threatened to invade Area 51.
Right.
And what I'm thinking is that tells me that this group became a relatively quasi-independent kind of extraterritorial state, if you will, very, very early on. And it took a military invention, the threat of a military intervention to curb it. So what my question here is do you think that threat was genuine, and what effect did that threat have on putting the brakes on this group, if any?
That man that I interviewed, that was I interviewed him in February 2013.
Mm-hmm.
He was living in northern Minnesota. He has since died, and I'll just give his last name, which was Stein, S-T-E-I-N. He was a very nice man, and it's true, Linda had interviewed him many years earlier.
Uh-huh.
And when she interviewed him, in fact, this is still, I think, in the Earth Files
Yes.
archives.
Yes.
And in fact, the audio of that is available, and his audio at that time is much better. He was much stronger,
Mm-hmm.
And in much better health, of course, when she interviewed him. I don't know what she's done with that audio, but anyway, what he said to me was very consistent with what he said to her. So he was, and by the way, I really genuinely like this man, and not only was I with him in this little motel room, but his son-in-law was present behind the camera. And I got to talk at great length with the son-in-law, who was a very mature man and was a theology student. These are very hard-working, honest people, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a very high regard for both of them. Anyway, this gentleman, Mr. Stein, I will just mention his name for the first time here, said to me that as a young man in the late 1950s, he worked with the Army Signal Intelligence, not with the CIA.
Okay.
I put the YouTube video out, really misrepresented him as former CIA.
Mm-hmm.
He was, as he put it, recruited or worked within a CIA program, but he himself was not a CIA operative. The point was, he initially started out by receiving CIA photographs of UFOs from Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And then his boss, said, we are going to Washington and we are meeting with the president. And they met with Eisenhower, who essentially said what you were just reporting. I'm not satisfied with answers that I'm getting about the extraterrestrial program at Area 51, and I want you to. And also, he said, two other individuals that he was sending there from another part of the country to go to Area 51, where they went. They were met by a local officer who toured them and showed them around. And yes, Eisenhower said to them, if I am not satisfied with the answers that I get out of the status of that program, I will invade, he said, with the First Army, I think out of Collins,
Mm-hmm.
Fort Collins. Now, when this man told me this story, look, I've never been able to get a confirmation of this. So that's the
Mm-hmm.
first thing I must say. I will say that I think that I believe him.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that he struck me as credible.
Mm-hmm.
So I can leave it at that. I've never found corroborative evidence, and I think that would be something worthwhile for people to look for. But it is indicative. This completely fits with what I have learned about Eisenhower's
Mm-hmm.
second term in office. Eisenhower totally lost control, as I can see it, of the United States military.
Yes.
It didn't matter that he was a 5-star general. It didn't matter that he was like a national hero and a very popular president for the most part. None of that mattered. I know I learned many years ago, for example, at around the same time period, late 50s, he was trying and failing to get a report from Strategic Air Command over
yes.
America's nuclear response strategy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and couldn't get one. Didn't get a meeting with Strategic Air Command until I think it was September or October 1960.
Yep.
Right at the end. And the head of SAC was a guy named General Thomas Powell. And Powell said something like, we're going to bomb the shit out of them before they know what happened, essentially obliterating half of the Northern Hemisphere.
Yep.
Eisenhower was so shocked.
Yes, he was.
And you know, in the book that I read at the time, that author, I think, believed that that was one of the key shocks that went into Eisenhower that prompted his military-industrial complex speech.
Yes, yes.
But anyway, the point is that I think on a number of fronts, it would be clear that Eisenhower would have lost control of this Pentagon. Now, let's go further and talk about a breakaway civilization, to what extent it was evolving. I don't know how credible such a threat to invade would have been, but maybe it could have happened. But it's also very clear that, you know, by the time this whole thing happened at Area 51, Eisenhower was basically done.
Right.
My best guess would be they would just do whatever they could to appease Eisenhower and bring, you know, whether Kennedy or Nixon, I don't think they would have known at that point, and just deal with that on that basis. But
well, let me ask you this question then, and the reason I brought this up is that I've been getting emails, Richard, and I wanted to run this past you, this thing specifically, as we talked, and now's as good a time as any. There's been this airlift military exercise recently that took place precisely in Nevada. Concentrated around the Nellis Range and so on, which, you know, is by Air Force standards a stone's throw from Area 51. And I've had a bunch of people speculating, and to be quite frank, I'm even kind of entertaining the idea myself that with President Trump, you know, and his Space Force Command and all of this stuff that he's been talking about, I'm wondering if what we're watching is yet another attempt on the part of the government to get some measure of control or influence back over that breakaway group by these kinds of demonstrations. What do you think about that hypothesis?
I don't know. I'm not up to speed on the airlift operation you're referring to, but I do think that there's a significant behind-the-scenes amount of stress going on right now between the Trump faction,
right?
You know, what people are now calling the deep state or the breakaway civilization. There's probably a lot of overlap between those two.
Right.
Yes, I think that's absolutely going on, and this battle's not over. And this could take you into you know, analysis of the Q documents, for example. And
right.
I don't know where I stand on that, but I do think that the fundamental position that whoever Q is outlining there's probably some truth to this, because I do believe. I'm not someone who thinks that it's all that Trump is part of the deep state's operation itself.
Right,
I actually do believe that Trump was a true wild card who was truly not supposed to be elected. And to everyone's shock, including his own, he gets elected and is now finding himself, you know, as a candidate. He put himself in direct opposition to the two fundamental pillars of American empire, that is neoconservative empire and neoliberal globalization. What I point out to people is that Trump's economic policies as a candidate were not very different, were radically similar to a fellow by the name of Ralph Nader from 20 years ago.
Yes.
Right? So Ralph Nader does this from the left, talking against globalization. He was the last person on the left to do so, to my knowledge. And Trump, really the first, well, let's say Ron Paul would be the first one on the right, on the Republican side, but then Trump talking against it. And by the way, just to show how far we have gone, in 1999, the city of Seattle had riots against the World Trade Organization.
I remember. Yep.
That's right. Anti-WTO riots. Who were those rioters? They weren't proto-Trump supporters. They were hacky sack playing, you know, wool hat wearing, you know, 20-something hippies, basically, who were essentially on the left. They were protesting this globalization, and they were right to do so, in my opinion.
Yep.
And in one generation, the entire left has been transformed from that into something totally different. But anyway, my point is, Trump comes into the White House identified clearly as the enemy.
Right.
He is the enemy. And I don't know which was worse from their point of view, the anti-neoliberal or the anti-neoconservative. Probably the anti-neoliberal is even worse. And that's the one that he has not caved on yet.
Right.
He's caved on the whole neocon, the anti-neocon stuff.
Right.
In my opinion, it's almost like, why not just have Hillary Clinton in there? I don't think his foreign policy is radically different. I think he would like to be friendly with Russia, but his hands are tied and he can't. They basically
can't do anything.
They broke him with Flynn 2 years ago when they took Flynn out. I think they made it very clear on pardon the pun, trumped up charges against Michael Flynn. But on the domestic side, on the economic side, on immigration and things like this, he's not caving. And so that makes him still the enemy. And that means behind the scenes, there are definite power plays that have to be going on. I mean, I don't think the man's an idiot. He sometimes seems very foolish to me in the way he's managing his White House. But I don't think he's a complete idiot. So I think that there's got to be something going on behind the scenes that puts him in opposition to this deep state apparatus, unless he's just totally caving. But I don't think so.
Well, let's put it in the context again of this arc of history from JFK to 9/11 and this transnational breakaway civilization group that's coming out of the UFO secrecy. If we view it in that way, it looks to me as if Trump is finding himself in almost exactly the same position. And I'm wondering again what you think about this idea that Trump is finding himself almost exactly in the same position vis-a-vis that group as Eisenhower found himself leaving office and as President Kennedy found himself entering office, because both of those two presidents had something to say about this. It looks to me like that Trump is trying to, by the Space Force Command and the military faction backing him, trying to reassert some sort of control or at least influence over this.
That's a possibility with the Space Force. Yeah. I do think that I've believed this for some time, that Trump, so funny to say this, but he shares certain things in common with Kennedy.
Yes, he does.
You know, in fundamentally, in that both of them seem to act as though they actually were running the show, running the country, and put themselves in opposition to the deep state.
Right.
Kennedy clearly did on a variety of levels, and Trump similarly. Now, in my opinion, honestly, it seems to me Kennedy was almost a little bit more effective dealing with these. Maybe that's why they killed him. You know, Kennedy was really moving the nuclear test ban treaty.
Right.
For one, his decapitation of the CIA after the Bay of his canceling of Operation Mongoose, which they started behind his back. Like, Kennedy was really quite effective, it seems to me, at opposing the deep state. And then his rolling out of non-Federal Reserve money.
Yes.
In 1963.
Yes.
Like, these were like throwing down the gauntlet.
Yes.
Trump, in my view, hasn't really, he may have tried, but I don't think he's done anything quite anywhere nearly as dramatic a challenge as Kennedy was doing.
Right.
But nonetheless he's trying in various ways, I think, to do
the chief difference that I see, Richard, between President Trump and President Kennedy is that while Kennedy was, I think, and I agree with you, much more effective in specifically targeting the pillars and props of power of that deep state, Trump is coming into office in a kind of a different fashion, because he does appear to have some element of that deep government or deep state behind him. And I'm wondering if this is affecting his strategy on how to deal with this, in your opinion, or if there's something, if he and we are being played for fools by that group in dealing with this deep state.
Yeah, the question is how advanced is Trump's analysis of this whole thing? Is he truly playing 4D or 5D chess, as some people have wondered?
Right.
And is he that far ahead like as he, as maybe Q would suggest, Trump is just stringing people along before he drops a hammer and the mass arrests begin and so forth. I somehow would be very surprised if that were to happen. Truthfully.
Me too.
I don't expect that. So I don't think Trump is playing 4D chess. I think, or 3D chess. I think he was a very effective candidate, and I think that the most of the media has pretty much succeeded in cornering him. They've certainly succeeded in stopping his Russian policy, and that's a horrible tragedy.
So do you think then, let's put it back in the context of this arc of history, this breakaway group. Do you think that there is an awareness on his part that this is what he's really fighting? Or do you think that he's simply of the view that this is politics as usual? And, is there that awareness in him that we saw in President Kennedy and that we saw in President Eisenhower?
I'd like to think that there is that awareness. But the thing is, when all that I can go on are judging his public statements. And like, I'm not aware of any hints that he has thrown that way that have made me prick up my ears and think, oh, a little dog whistle here or there. I haven't detected that. What he's still, like, his tweets are still basically like a junior high schooler going after people he doesn't like. And I think, maybe this is just his style, but I would have thought that if you were to be made to understand that you are fighting an incredibly sophisticated, powerful faction that really wants to take you down.
The only thing I've seen, Richard, to kind of buttress your argument that maybe he is not fully aware of the existence of this thing. The only contradiction that I've seen is his appointment of General Milley to head the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I found that extremely interesting because Milley, of course, was at the time that he made this speech where he was talking about the Army having to fight hybrid people and little green men, which everybody at the time wrote off. Well, that's just Army slang for fighting Russians, and so on and so forth. Well, I don't think so.
Interesting.
No, I don't think so. Milley is a 4-star general and now, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That to me was one little indicator that, maybe Trump is thinking in terms of this deep state thing. But I'm with you. Other than that appointment and his remarks about, we need another secret space force, we already have one and now we need another. Other than that, I haven't seen any clue from him that, he understands that he's fighting something deeply ingrained in the power structures of this country and of the world. It's
a matter of degree here. So I think he's aware that he is fighting an entrenched system.
Right. Yes.
He's well aware of it. And the question is, how far does that system go? How deep does that go?
And how deep does his knowledge of that system go? In other words, is he tying this to this breakaway civilization?
As a candidate, he, whereas I thought a lot of his economic statements, from my point of view, were right on. He did not impress me with his knowledge of geopolitics at all. I didn't think he really knew a thing. And I was surprised. You've got a, 70-something-year-old, very successful businessman, worldly business everywhere in the world. And I thought he sounded like he was a high school student.
Right.
So I was not impressed by that. Now, he's intelligent, and this is a guy who can think on his feet. So it's not that he can't get up to speed, and maybe he has. So I wouldn't rule it out, Joseph. I don't know. It's hard for me to say one way or the other, and I certainly don't have an ear.
Well, this is the post 9/11 world that we're in. We're having to read the tea leaves all the time, and
we're like sociologists.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we're doing phrenology or something. But
it's really true.
But if we go back to this idea now that, and I'm agreed with you, I've been talking about the transnational nature of this breakaway civilization group for a long time. So I want to go to the question of disclosure, because this is where I think the epistemological rubber meets the road. If this group, let's just concoct a speculative scenario or a hypothetical scenario. If this group decided that we need to reveal all of this stuff, and if they did so, how would we evaluate whatever information that they have put out? Is ET a threat? Is ET not a threat? What do we have to do to move this forward? Is the cynicism level now in the post 9/11 world so high that this group could literally tell the truth and no one believed them?
Possibly, yes. That's possibly true. It's not only that. I remember thinking a long time ago, like, what if Nazi Germany had disclosed
Mm-hmm.
ET reality? Like, what if Hitler had disclosed it? You're dealing with an authoritarian, totalitarian regime that was certainly not above lying, even casually, about all kinds of things. And so the question is, would people have believed it? Like, if, well, under any circumstances, you'd have to provide evidence one way or the other that
Right.
outside people would be able to examine. So I think if there were to be we have to ask, like, what would be the things that would prompt the current elite to decide that disclosure is a good thing? I can think of a few. One thing is that they're really not able to stop this from happening forever. I
Right.
believe that there's a kind of drip disclosure process that's been going on for a while. And I really believe, it's been a year and a day since the New York Times published the article on the ATIP program and the UFO program within Pentagon. It's been a year. And it got me thinking, what's changed and has there been a change? I think there has, but I actually do see that as a part of a long-term disclosure plan. I think that's where my position is now. I don't see that as pure disinformation. I see it as a little bit of everything.
Right.
In other words, the New York Times decided, I feel, that they had to get out in front of this and say something because information was coming out regardless. And so let them tell it and let them package it the way that they wanted to. And they were quite successful in doing that. So, in other words, there's public pressure from below. We're in a world where we're able to communicate in ways that were not imaginable 20 years ago, much less 30, 50 years ago. And so we're having global conversations all the time on this subject. And there is genuine cultural change happening. And there is genuine leaks of information that's coming out. And in that type of a situation, there's this pressure that is happening. And ultimately, I do believe that there will come a time when it's an inevitability.
Yes.
But when it happens, my assumption is that information will be released. But think of it this way, like, if there's a mountain of data that they have amassed on this subject, you could disclose by just giving up a little sliver.
Right.
Sliver that you can cherry pick.
Yes, exactly.
Benefit. And that's your disclosure. So what information would they give out? Well, probably to make it seem as threatening as they need to have us scared, but not too threatening so that we're really scared, so that we come running to them, to the state, for protection, because that's always the thing. And in such a way as to perceive the state as the good guys protecting the public. Like, they'll be able to do that with however they want to cherry pick their data.
Well, do you think, since we're talking about the subject of disclosure and Trump and deep state and this whole arc of history, do you think it's possible or feasible that, you had the DeLong operation, his contact with the Podestas, and therefore with oh, hang on, Richard. I think I've got someone at the door. Hang on. Hang on, little girl. Hang on.
I'm trying to read Joseph's books in the background, and the resolution's just beyond.
Come and lay down.
They look good.
Come and lay down. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I should have known that the one day I schedule an interview is the day that the mailman's going to drop off a package. But anyway, so let's go back to this arc of history and this transnational breakaway civilization group. And let's factor in now the Tom DeLonge operation, his contact with the Podestas, there with his entry into Hillary Clinton's campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's possible, given the scenario I've been outlining, General Milley is chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Space Force president, and all of this, do you think that it is possible that some sort of timetable of disclosure was planned had Hillary Clinton become president, and Trump becoming president interrupted or set this timetable off, or another faction is trying to regain control over this whole apparatus? What do you think about all of this politics in terms of what we've been talking about?
It's funny. For the longest time, I argued with Stephen Bassett about this continuously. Bassett is a Democrat. He has no problem saying that, and he hates Trump with a burning passion in his soul, and so he argued with me, and he stated publicly that he believed Hillary Clinton was going to be the disclosure president. I think he still believes this firmly, and I continually said, Hillary Clinton, never. I've never believed that she would. Now, having said that, I'm going to acknowledge that it's possible that, because some of these pieces do fit into place. DeLonge's talking with Podesta, and there's a couple of ways to interpret Podesta here. My normal interpretation has been that Podesta is a political operative first and foremost,
right,
who is using the UFO subject really for political gain.
Yes.
People think that sounds silly, but it's not silly anymore.
No, it doesn't.
It might have been silly. It's not. Today, the UFO subject, there's a certain cool factor to it that can appeal if you handle it the right way. And I think Podesta was able to do that, so that you might be able to garner some votes.
Right.
And that is one way that I have interpreted it. And I think that's still my primary interpretation, because when WikiLeaks released the correspondence between DeLonge and Podesta, it's all DeLonge talking. Podesta didn't really know how involved, if at all, John Podesta was with any of this.
Right.
Well, it's also true they had a Google Hangout, just like we're having now.
Right.
Podesta had it with DeLonge, and DeLonge brought in I think 2 or 3 of the guys that he was working with, 2 generals and the then head of the Skunk Works. When WikiLeaks put all that information out, those 3 guys went running, and they were gone.
Yeah.
So it is possible. Like, these were they're important people, and then essentially what you end up with is the B team. That's what To the Stars Academy is now, and it's not that Hal Puthoff is a second rate, by no means. I have a lot of respect for Hal Puthoff, and the other individuals on the To the Stars are also very, very impressive, but they're not generals.
Right.
They're not heads of Skunk Works, for goodness sake. So it does seem like you could argue there was a kind of regrouping that took place.
Could we say at the minimum that there was some sort of UFO angle or secret space program angle or breakaway civilization angle to the politics of the last election that were kind of playing out in the background, rather than say that Trump, upset the timetable and so on and so forth, but just notch it down, that there was some sort of politicking going on about this group and about the subject of UFOs, secret space programs, breakaway civilizations, and so on?
Maybe, yeah, I'm sure there was, but the question is, who would they have been supporting?
Who would they have been doing? Right.
Would they support Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump? And I don't know. I mean, Trump I actually really side with Julian Assange, who weeks before the election said Trump won't be permitted to win. He said that. And when Assange said that, that struck me as exactly right, that Trump will not be permitted. All you have to do is see 95% of the mainstream media was vociferously anti-Trump, other than Fox News. They were the only one. Everyone else demonized Trump. And I don't see that as an accident. So I see the U.S. and the Western media establishment is working on behalf of their paymasters, their masters, who are this deep state, and I assume the breakaway group.
All right. So let's put this in a more international political context.
Unless the breakaway group is a separate faction from the global financial elite.
That's a good point, and I think to a certain extent there is some separation between the two. How deeply that goes, I personally don't know. I've been arguing, as you know, that they set up very early on a hidden system of finance in addition to the black budget to supply the funding for all of this through whatever means that they were using. But I do think to a certain extent they're separate. So let's ask this question. Rather than focus on domestic politics, let's ask the question about this transnational breakaway civilization. Where in other countries do you think it would have a presence that would be able to manipulate or influence political events, not just in this country, but even geopolitically? If we're going to talk about a transnational group and a breakaway group, they're certainly going to be leaving their fingerprints in other countries and in other events. So speculate a bit on that. What do you think that might be?
Well, one thing we would want to look at, I would think, would be China.
Yes.
So powerful and important.
Yes.
Now, I don't know what their fingerprints would be. It certainly does. It's very evident to me that what China is doing in their society right now is perfectly designed to further the development of a global totalitarianism.
Yes,
they're
absolutely
rolling out mandatory within a year nationwide the entire social credit system, which is horrifically dystopian, and it has its defenders. I just listened to these awful Anglo metrosexual two dudes. Sorry, but they were. I just want to punch them in the face repeatedly.
Yes,
you really do. You just gotta. But anyway, they're like, "Oh no, it's actually really pretty good." And I thought, "What?" Anyway, if someone's listening to this and they don't know what the social credit system is, just please Google this and look into it. It's horrible.
It is.
But anyway,
so they're beta testing in China, is what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. And it's not that there's not a native Chinese element to this. Chinese society, lends itself to this kind of complete, total control system that we're rolling out. But I have to assume that, China is not an isolationist country anymore.
No
matter how separate their culture is from the rest of the world, and there's still very, very distinct culture. I mean, China is almost like another universe in so many ways to Westerners, but not financially, not economically, and not even really politically.
So
because Western companies are all set up there.
Right. So you would, if I can add to this scenario that you're building, the technology transfers to China that took place were, in your thinking, in this scenario that you're building of China as kind of a beta test for this group, would those technology transfers have been facilitated, in your opinion, by this breakaway transnational group?
I've always assumed that yes, because when you just look at China's unbelievably rapid transformation in one generation, from third-rate technological power to first-rate technological power, I think there's been a lot of help.
Yes.
And a lot of it's very conventional. Western companies setting up their technology in China and the Chinese people working, incredibly diligently and intelligently to mimic and copy Western tech. I mean, they've done that incredibly well.
Mm-hmm.
But they've also, I'm sure there's been a tremendous amount of behind the scenes technological help that we're not aware of.
Well, another question with respect to China and its close partner Russia, and I'm going to throw Europe in here too, since we're talking about a transnational breakaway group. To what extent then do you see the footprints of that group with the Russians, with the Europeans? Would the French Comida statements a few years ago be seen as coming out of that group? Would the European Space Agency explorations that are just bizarre in some circumstances, would this be being driven by that group, in your opinion?
Well, as far as where there's a lot to unpack there. So
yeah, I'm sorry, Richard. I know I'm throwing the kitchen sink at you. So.
Well, I'm going to do my best here. So I think Russia and China, they're very closely allied. So I don't want my previous remarks about China to make it seem like I think China is completely in bed 100% with the breakaway group or the Western, right. U.S. dominated globalist group, because they're not. There's definitely competition there. China and Russia are certainly have become a block of power, and a significant block to the group that really is using the United States to achieve hegemonic control over everything. Probably this number one enemy to those people, other than Trump, would be Vladimir Putin.
Right.
Putin is, as far as I can see, a classic nationalist, a classic true Russian nationalist in the very best sense of that word.
Yes.
Someone who's, as far as I can see, genuinely looking out for the best interests of his nation as a whole, and doing a very good job, incidentally, at maintaining it. All you have to do is think back to Russia during the 1990s when it was run by Boris Yeltsin.
Oh, yes.
Handed over essentially every aspect of the country to Western finance, and Russian life collapsed. Russian life expectancy plummeted.
Yes.
A horrible, horrible decade. And Putin, by degrees, put a stop to that.
Yes.
And that makes him enemy number one. He is. It's not that he's opposed in every way to every single thing that globalization is bringing. What I think he's opposed to is a systematic pillaging of his nation.
Yes.
And so they want him gone. They want him gone as soon as possible, and they just haven't been able to succeed in that. He's too smart.
Which leads to a question. Why is this group, let's assume for a moment that the globalists, the international financiers, the Anglosphere, whatever you wish to call it, let's assume for a moment that they are tightly interwoven with this international breakaway civilization exotic technology group.
So in other words, let's say the U.S. geopolitical faction is the dominant one in the global breakaway civilization group.
Right.
I would assume as well.
Well, to what extent then is this pillaging operation, or let me rephrase that, why is it necessary for that group to engage in the pillaging operations that they've been engaged in? You know, I'm thinking of the bailouts and all of that nonsense. Why are they doing this? Is their financial pool drying up, and this is the best way that they can think of to keep going with their black projects and so on? You know, what's going on here?
My opinion, I've just always felt that their greed is boundless.
Right.
I think ordinary people don't really, and myself included, it's hard for us to appreciate the level of greed that exists, the amount of the avarice that exists in that upper level. We talk about the 1%, but we're talking about the top 1% of the 1% of the 1%.
Right.
And because the way wealth is owned in this world, as I've said over and over again, in a room of 100 people with $100, if that was our world, one person would own about 45 of those dollars.
Yep.
And that's 1%. Now, if you take that 1% and break it down, within that, the amount of wealth owned, I don't know it precisely, but I know it's similar in the concentration. So in other words, the top 1% of that group owns
Right.
roughly half. In fact, that's true. The top 1% of the 1% owns something like 20% of all global wealth. So it's an unbelievable amount. So in that type of a situation, these people, it's like asking an Egyptian peasant from 5,000 years ago, like, why does the pharaoh need all that gold? Pharaoh lives great. Well, partly the pharaoh doesn't really compete with the peasants. Pharaoh's competing with other sovereign leaders in the region.
Right.
And I think that's how these people at the top of our society, they compete with each other in terms of conspicuous consumption. And what I think is happening, Joseph, honestly, I look at the UFO ET situation, I look at the breakaway civilization, and I see also a future we haven't even discussed of essentially a transhumanist
Yes.
movement that's happening. And I also see a world in which we see it right happening before our eyes, a complete surveillance totalitarian state globally. And why? Because people, this is a horrible thing to say, but people are no longer necessary for the creation of most wealth. What is now necessary are computer algorithms, artificially intelligent programs. Labor, physical labor is largely being replaced.
Mm-hmm.
What's going to happen when Google rolls out truly functional driverless cars? That is the number one occupation, driving, for non-college educated men in the country. What are they going to do? There's nothing for people to do anymore. And it's not just that type of labor. It's going right up the chain with increasingly smart algorithms that are taking jobs away from people. So you do not need old-fashioned human physical or intellectual power nearly as much as we've needed throughout all of our history. So an entire swath of humanity is going to be totally redundant. And what is going to happen with them? And we have to assume those people at the very top of our little pyramid hierarchy know full well this is going down, and they're going to make plans. And that is one reason they have to do not only the global surveillance and intimidation of the population, but also transforming the culture to create a culture of dependency, a culture of collectivism, destroy individuality, destroy these traditional virtues of independent thought. And it's happening. We see it happening. So they're transforming the culture. Now, will that be enough? And then, of course, flood the market with drugs, both legal and illegal. Give them opioids and give them stupid television to waste their lives sitting in front of. So that's the plan. The question that I'm asking is, will that be enough?
Yeah, precisely.
Will
it work?
And if it's not enough, make people unhealthy, make them lazy, make them have no hope. All of this is clearly happening. You go to Europe. In Greece, what is the number? It's like 30-40% of young people
are out of
maybe 50%. And many of them are living with their parents because they have now Greece is basically just an open air prison, but the rest of Europe is going the same way.
Yep, it is. And this country is not far behind.
Throughout the world. So all of this none of these things are isolated. I look at the UFO phenomenon. There's a definite push among those of us who are interested in this to get this information out, and it does cause ripples. But the question is, you asked us earlier, if there is ever a disclosure, how will we know if it's truthful? How will we know? How will we be able to confirm any of this stuff? And we're almost living in like a post-truth world.
Yes.
The ground's been pulled out from underneath us, and I know I've just hit on a lot of different points here, so I probably should have focused a little bit better on this.
No, that's okay, because you're echoing the same concerns I have. I'm seeing the same thing. They're trying to transform the culture, and they're trying to do it in a hurry because they know all of this is coming down.
Right.
Which is why I think this whole disclosure question now kind of comes front and center, because if they're ripping out the ground of virtue, individual creative thought, and so on, if a disclosure is to happen, who's going to buy it? This is the problem. And I think it's a big conundrum for them, because they've got to maintain enough trust in existing institutions that they're shattering at the same time.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
and I personally, I don't know about you, Richard, but I personally don't see this whole program is going to work. They're undercutting too many of the pillars of this civilization to have it work. And we're seeing the results right now in France, and it's spreading throughout the rest of Europe. There's more going on with these protests, I think, than meets the eye. I mean, you've got French generals now writing President Macron that he's committing treason, and there's a whole list of these people that have signed off on that in the French military, which I find is very unusual. You see kind of the same thing going on in France that you see in this country. There's a certain faction of the military behind Trump, and there's a certain faction that isn't. There's a certain faction of the intelligence community behind him, and there's a certain faction that isn't. So it looks to
Rome had their civil war.
Exactly. And what it looks to me, what's happening, Richard, is that they've set up this culture war, or maybe not by design, but it's certainly there. And now they're losing control of it. This is what disturbs me. And this is why I think the epistemological question here is they've got to deal at some point with the emergence of these new technologies. Like you say, there's been a slow drip, there's a trickle that's been going on really since 9/11, if not shortly before, of all these new technologies that are coming out. And the implications of them are eventually going to lead to the topic of ET, UFOs, and so on and so forth. There's just no way around it. So the thing that I'm wondering is, how are they going to handle this? Because they've done such a, if I can use a little French here, they've done such a piss poor job of it so far.
Yes. I don't know how this is going to turn out. It depends on the day of the week. I mean, there are times I really believe. I'm not a particularly optimistic person when it comes to these issues.
I'm not either.
So I'm going to reformulate my thinking on this. So I think what we are seeing is, people like Trump, Putin, other people who are now identified as on the right politically in Europe and elsewhere are a faction. They're a reaction against a certain direction that this world has been going. Basically, it's the direction the world's been going is ending nations, definitely ending nations. That's number one goal. The creation of a new culture to fit this new model, all in the service of financial control. So we're seeing a reaction against that. Now, there is definitely, I agree, there's a behind-the-scenes faction relating to this knowledge of an extraterrestrial reality, and we'll call it the breakaway civilization. And the real question that we want to know, and I would like to find the answer to this, and I keep trying to talk to people who may give me clues here, but essentially we want to know, what is the position of people like Donald Trump and Putin toward this greater reality? What are they trying to do? My guess is that the Russians have a separate infrastructure to deal with this. They certainly had a separate infrastructure, I think, in the days of the Soviet Union. That infrastructure probably gave maybe some of the keys of the kingdom away to the Americans during the 90s. That's totally possible. In other words, they may have shared some of their information with the Americans at that time. I don't know, but it's possible.
Right.
But I do think that what we're seeing is a resurgence of Russian separatism in the age of Putin. So I think that they're kind of a wild card in this. And I don't know what their attitude is. Same with the Chinese, to some extent. I can't figure out what I think their long-term plan is relating to the UFO ET reality. One thing about China that I've learned is the Chinese government is deeply interested in the UFO ET phenomenon, and they are completely on top of every single Chinese UFO group in that country, which, by the way, they encourage the existence of Chinese ufology. And all of Chinese ufology is constantly reporting to the government on what they learn. This I have learned from two
I can believe it.
Japanese ufologists. So the Chinese government's interested in this. The Russian
All right.
government is interested in this.
Let's ask the $64 trillion question then. Rather than, if we're watching this global culture, and I'm putting that in quotation marks because I think the greedsters, as you've described them, are utterly without any sort of cultural grounding at all. They seem to be kind of sociopathic and narcissistic in that respect. But let's ask the $64 trillion question. Rather than talking about disclosure, can you speculate a bit for us on the possibility of some sort of intervention in this whole process, precisely on the part of ET? You know, back in 2015, I gave that talk in the Secret Space Program conference that, in my thinking, this was one of the front and center issues that this breakaway UFO group had to contend with, and probably were trying to contend with it in some form or fashion. So what do you think are the possibilities that they might be worried about some sort of intervention, and even the possibility of an intervention itself in all of this development?
Yeah, the answer to that question depends on how much of the lore that we want to believe, or how much of the research that we want to credit. One thing that I definitely believe about these other beings is that they are secretive by and large.
Mm-hmm.
They are, whatever they are doing, they do not appear to want us to be involved in what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
They do not appear to be openly telling us a thing about what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
They may very well be engaged, as Dr. David Jacobs has believed for years,
Mm-hmm.
in a program of creating human-looking hybrids to infiltrate human society in preparation for what he calls the Great Change.
Mm-hmm.
I just interviewed David Jacobs recently, and so this is fresh in my mind. And I've been actually just of late giving a lot of thought to his research again.
Yeah, I have too. I think he's onto something.
Right. I believe strongly he's onto something, and the only question that I have is his picture complete, or is are there gaps?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there are probably gaps here, but
Mm-hmm.
but to ask, like, are the aliens going to intervene in our process? I'm not inclined to think so. I don't think so.
Not in any direct, overt sort of way, in other words.
No. One thing that the only speculation that I have that they intervene in the last century or two is there does seem to be a pattern in which UFO sightings are of technology that's just 20 to 30 to 50 years ahead of our own.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back through the reports through the 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
through the 19th century, through the 18th century, there are some classic UFO reports in there. So there are some reports where someone will say, I watched a star divide into three, zoom across the sky, and reemerge and take off. Like, those reports do exist from 500 years ago.
Yep.
But
Yep,
by
they
and
do.
large, they don't exist like that. By and large, they're seen in ways that people at the time, that made sense to them.
Mm-hmm.
I saw the Virgin Mary, or I saw a craft and they threw a rope down with an anchor.
Yep.
Like this type of stuff. So it's hard for me to make sense of, but if I assume that there's an extraterrestrial other component to this, then my guess would be, just as Vallée once hypothesized, these aliens are nudging us along. It's almost like they're showing us, here, try this invention, try this. Look at these airships, how fast they go. You can do that, and so on. Now, I don't know how much of this I believe or not, but that's the only type of intervention, the only kind of open intervention that I can think of that these other beings might be engaging in, other than behind the scenes, clandestine, screwing around with our genetics through a hybridization program.
Well,
I don't expect them to throw a monkey wrench into the plans of the human secrecy. I don't expect that.
Well, yeah, I don't either. But the genetic program that Dr. Jacobs has been talking about, what fascinates me about that, Richard, and about this whole idea of a kind of covert, subversive influence, if I can use that word, is it is so similar to what we read in ancient manuscripts from Mesopotamia, Genesis 11 and so on and so forth, where you have this kind of coy type of manipulation of humanity, even at the
Yeah.
genetic level. And that pattern fascinates me because it's consistent over time. So I tend to agree with you that if there's going to be anything like that, rather than the Tower of Babel type of intervention, we also have to consider this might be some sort of long-term game that they're playing. And the question is, what, in your opinion, then is, if there is an agenda behind this long-term game, what might it be beyond, trying to prod us in certain directions? Is there some other agenda that you've been able to detect dealing with this breakaway group and these types of reports?
Okay, well, there's a long-term plan of these other beings and the long-term plan of our human handlers.
Right.
So I want to talk about the human group first. I think the long-term plan of this breakaway group is actually very simple, and it's the creation of a new form of totalitarianism.
Right.
It's simple. They want total control in every way over our lives.
Right.
Complete control, and that will include, if there are too many redundant people on this planet, I would expect them fully to, shed their inhibitions and figure out a way to eliminate however many useless eaters they decide they want to eliminate as they see it. Now, I don't think that that's happening right now as a plan, but I don't know. Maybe it is. But I do think they want to create total control, total dependency for now. And maybe 50 years down the road, they'll think of something else. But I think they are going to create a world in which there is nothing left open to chance. And that means nothing left open to freedom.
Okay, let me interject there. Are they doing this because they're under some sort of time pressure or threat?
That's a possibility. There's, you can envision a possibility in which some well-meaning people who are in the know are thinking, we are under a serious threat by these other beings, and we need to organize, like, right now, into a society where we can act in a unified way to deal with this threat. Now, the question is, do we need all 7 billion plus of the population to deal with this? Probably not. Most of the people will just get in the way. So you need to keep them ignorant and out of it. You need to mobilize the core elite, however that is, and use whatever advanced technology, including breakaway technology, to deal with. That's total possibility. And if you're going to have a viable breakaway group, well, you need total secrecy, and you therefore need, the opposite of transparency. And a lot of money. And so all of that would fit the scenario. That would fit.
Okay.
But look, the other side of it, though, is that, these are very self-serving goals for them.
Yes.
They might justify it. They probably would justify it and say, this shit is, this is necessary because people are stupid and people are incapable of defending themselves. We have to do it for them. But it's also very convenient because they benefit financially and in having power. So power is an addictive thing for people, and they don't want to give that up. So it's sort of all fits.
It's a crisis of opportunity that they can use.
Yeah. But the other thing is, I'm a firm believer that the rapidly encroaching total totalitarianism that's happening is also by default. It's not all by design. In other words, as I said earlier, I've come to believe that the highly technological global system that we've can't help but create necessitates that there's an inevitability almost in that, traditional human jobs are no longer going to be necessary, and you've got just a lot of extra people here. And what do you do with them all? Like, I've asked myself, just some more conventional terms, what would a guy like Trump do if he really wanted to keep all the jobs in the United States? Like, can you really stop this whole process?
Right.
Can you truly stop globalization? At the very most you might be able to do is ease off with the pedal to the metal globalization approach.
Right.
Really is all he's trying to do. And that might hold off the inevitable for another generation, but not much more than that. So I don't really know what can be done. So I think that there's this system that's created by default. It's like we can't even help it. These structures that we have in place, global financial capitalism, call it that, global transnational corporate power, the technology. Like, you have to have a bureaucracy. You've got, if you want to make a cell phone call from internationally, you need structures in place.
Right.
You need rules and regulations, and
Right.
and so all of that is happening. So there's a default element for this totalitarianism that we're seeing.
Right.
But it's also by design,
Right.
because they want this. So that's what we're moving toward, and they can justify it however they justify it. Then there's the goal of this other group that's here. So is it, as people like Dave Jacobs will say, and they're here to take over? Well, if that's the case, they have a ready-made infrastructure that is waiting for them,
Bingo.
with soon-to-be 5G technology throughout the world. You want to talk about total surveillance? They can actually inherit this system that we've just created for them.
Yep.
It's a really good system.
Yep.
They actually can insert themselves, if they're really smart, into our structure of power and just run it. Of course,
just go.
You might ask yourself, what's the difference? Who the hell is controlling us? We're still being controlled. It may not matter at all as far as that's concerned.
Yeah.
That's one thing I just really wonder, like, is David just too late in worrying about it? Like, the real worry, does it matter who's controlling you if you're totally controlled with all of your freedom siphoned out anyway?
Yep.
Now, are there positive extraterrestrials who actually genuinely care about us? You hear this all the time. I don't know if I believe any of that. I just don't.
Yeah, that's my problem, and that's why I'm wondering about the epistemology of all of this. We hear the good extraterrestrials, we hear about bad extraterrestrials, and the bottom line is, how do we decide which is which, especially in this very cynical culture? And I'm not seeing that anybody really has been addressing this question, other than maybe yourself, Dr. Valet, Dr. Jacobs, and a very, very narrow handful of people. But it's a question, like it or not, that we're going to be facing at some point, someday, maybe not tomorrow. But, we go out, we get the warp drive or whatever it is that NASA wants to create and start going out and visiting other places, and we're going to run into it sooner or later. So the question is, the problem, I should say, is that there's only a certain narrow segment of people, as far as I can tell, within ufology that's really been trying to address this philosophical problem. And that's what it's coming down to. And like you say, we're creating this huge global infrastructure that someone else may just walk in and inherit. And it wouldn't take that much to put the right people in the right places and, the nodes of power, and you've got it.
We are so overmatched by this phenomenon globally.
Yeah.
I mean, look, we don't even know how many UFO sightings each year there are worldwide.
Right.
But a simple thing like that. We've got some pretty good data for North America. Okay. MUFON and the National UFO Reporting Center collect reports in North America. By the way, it's like over 15,000 a year, raw reports. That doesn't mean they're all aliens, but nonetheless, we could get data. But there's nothing comparable in any other part of the world. There are other groups that collect reports haphazardly, and you get a few here and there, but we don't really have numbers to work with. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is dealing with these other beings. So there's Dave Jacobs, who's essentially really close to retiring altogether. If he hasn't already, it sounds to me like he's essentially retired. A couple of other people who do hypnotic regression of abductees. I personally feel this is a very important thing to do. Most of them who do it, honestly, I don't know how good they are. And they're certainly not going deep the way David goes to try to get an accurate picture of what's happening. So in other words, we have really no information to work with. On top of that, we're in a culture where this whole subject is denigrated and laughed at. Still, even now today, it is no one in academia is dealing with this. The academic community is hopeless at this point. I've lost really all respect.
Ditto that.
It's embarrassing.
Yeah, it
It's
is.
Embarrassment. To think, you and I lived in that world. I wanted to be part of that world. You probably did too.
Yep.
Thank God we are out of that world.
Oh, listen, I'm into that. I'm so glad I'm out of it. I couldn't take it. Seeing what I see now going on, I couldn't take it. I couldn't survive.
We need a thriving, good academic community to help do this, because there's a lot of brain power there. There are some smart people there, and the fact that they dismiss all of this should indicate to us just how effective the disinformation program has been.
Yep.
So you have some of the best people who should be working on this are not working on it because they think it's all nonsense. So we're in a really bad state. We're in a bad way in trying to understand this. We talk about epistemology. It's key, because this is a hard subject.
Yes.
How do we know what we know? And
yes.
the fact is, the only way we're going to begin to know a little bit is by having many more people actively doing good research.
Yes, absolutely, and not getting weighed down with distractions about blue chickens.
You do good work on a good day. I'll do good work. There's a few other people who will do good work, and that's not enough.
No, it isn't. It isn't. It really isn't. It needs to change dramatically, especially given what we're entering. And this is why I wanted to talk to you. And we're getting down towards the end of our time. I think we've been on about an hour and a half. But if you were to leave the viewers with any one thing or set of things about this whole arc of history that we've been talking about, this breakaway group, what would it be? What would your Christmas present be?
One thing that I would remind everyone is that these people are relying on secrecy to do what they are doing. That's one important thing. They are relying on their ability to be insulated from us viewing them. And that should tell us that they have something to fear. So that if enough truth were to be revealed, their programs would be at risk. That includes the unbelievable level of financial criminality that they're engaged in.
Yes.
It's probably the number one thing.
Yes.
And
I would agree.
What people like us have to do, and people listening who are inclined should consider doing, is to do a deep financial study of who owns what and what they're doing to control the flow of money.
Yep, absolutely.
I don't know anyone who's doing this, really. I've had the last 20 years. Simple question, 3 words: who owns what? When you really get down to it, who are the people who are the primary shareholders of major corporations? And you can't get names.
Yeah, you can't get names. You cannot find out the transitioning shareholders, not just of the Federal Reserve, but for crying out loud, Richard, you go all the way back to the Second Bank and First Bank of the United States. It's nearly impossible to find who the shareholders were.
It's like, oh my God. So that's problem number one. And so we've got some serious work cut out for us, but the fact that they're operating and require secrecy should be a key for us to understand. And one thing I just would have to say to anyone is the most important things to remember is in our life, all right, human beings have always dealt with injustice. They've always dealt with the odds stacked against them, every generation in all of human history. And what we can do to make things better is first thing, not make things worse. So not be difficult in our personal lives.
Mm-hmm.
Help, not hinder.
Mm-hmm.
Be brave, not cowardly. Have integrity, not a lack of integrity. Like,
Right.
this is a simple thing to say, and it doesn't fix the larger problem. But ultimately, all we have are these lives, this life that we have.
Right.
If we have multiple lives, if there's heaven, great. I don't know that. What I know is I've got this life.
Right.
And I can make choices throughout the day to make this life worthwhile and something that I can respect or not. And you do that by being brave, and you do that by doing things that you believe are the right thing.
Yep.
And anyone can do that.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And if we want to go further, then let's study and research and not lose heart. It's easy to lose heart. I've seen this happen so many times. I know you have too. There's a phenomenon that happens with certain people. They dive into this subject and become so cynical, so lacking in hope. It changes them, and it's not a good change.
Yep.
All right. So what you have to do is you have to go into this. And, I think Nietzsche said it, you go in with a light heart.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You have to.
Yes, you have to. You have to. You have to stare into the abyss, but keep the light heart. Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's very necessary. And that will allow you to keep going. And then you can be a benefit to other people.
Yep. I totally agree. Owning the culture and being virtuous to the extent that you can.
And I'll say something else. I've developed over the years certain spiritual beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And, look, they're only beliefs. I don't pretend that I have knowledge. I don't pretend that I know that when I die, I'll have a spirit that goes somewhere. But at this point in my life, and for quite some time, I've developed the belief that there is another reality beyond this physical incarnation that I have. And that's something that I'm glad that I have for right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that in mind, I remind myself that there are higher purposes.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And we're here right now in this reality. And so let's make it work. Let's make it count. And so that wherever we go to the next place in our destination, that we're proud of what we did here.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Richard, I want to thank you for being with us. I know I've kept you probably a little longer than I said I would.
I've enjoyed it tremendously, Joseph.
Well, I did too. And I want to thank you. I want to wish you a very Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and to everybody that's watching. So thank you for being with us, Richard.
Please let me thank you and wish you the very same back to you, as well as to the members of your website.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I'm sure extremely impressive people. So you and I share so much in our perspective and our directions, and I feel it's really important. I really like supporting what you do and the members of your site.
And vice versa. Thank you so much, Richard, for being with us. All right, folks, that's it for December Dialogues, and I'll see you in 2019. Bye-bye.